Many Christians struggle to defend the truth of the Christian worldview. But what if there's a podcast dedicated to answering the toughest objections to Christianity? That's the mission of the Daily Apologist podcast, and on today's episode, I continue my series on the deconversion of Jonathan Steingard, lead singer of the Christian band Hawk Nelson. Hello everyone, it's been a week since I last recorded, 2 weeks since I last recorded. I took a week off, and I've had a lot of questions. People have been messaging me or emailing me saying, hey, was everything okay with the podcast? Just want to let everybody know, I recently got into the Theologos program at Oxford University. It's a 1-year study of theology and philosophy. And so I've just been getting all the preliminary things ready to go. So it's just been a crazy week, and I just decided, listen, I need a break from recording. But hey, I'm back and going to continue this series. Also recorded a podcast for the next series that's coming out next month called When the YouTube Atheist Comes to Town. Had a great conversation with Vila Bianca, who's a host of Talk Heathen out of the atheist community of Austin. So, as we talked about last time, Jonathan Steingard, the lead singer of the Christian band Hawk Nelson, announced that he no longer believed in God. And in his very long and thoughtful and elaborate post on Instagram, one of the first things that he mentioned was the problem of evil. If God exists, why is there evil in the world? It seems like God and evil should not coexist if God is all-powerful and all-loving. And so what we talked about in the previous episode was the logical problem of evil, and we showed that that's not a logical inconsistency, that it is coherent to, or it is possible that God and evil can both coexist. And so what the skeptic will normally do is they'll say, okay, well, it may not be logically impossible for God and evil to coexist, but it just seems like on the basis of the evil that we see in the world, that it's probable that God does not exist. So when we're talking about the intellectual problem of evil, this specific argument within that framework is called the probabilistic problem of evil, or the evidential problem of evil. And so notice the subtle switch there. The first argument, the logical version, says that it's impossible that God and evil can exist. This version, the evidential version, says that it's just highly improbable that God exists given the existence of evil in the world. Now, admittedly, this is a more modest claim, since the skeptic has moved from absolute terms to the realm of probability. So we need to really look at this argument, because if it's true that it's just more probable than not that God does not exist, then we need to seriously consider giving up Christianity. But here's a couple of things that we need to really get our minds around when we're dealing with this objection. And the first one is that when we're dealing with probabilities, an accurate appropriation of probability ought to be given with the full scope of evidence at hand, right? And the other thing that we need to know about probabilities is they're relative to the background information that's being used by the person who's putting forth the probability. So, for instance, let me give an example. Let's say I'll use my brother Dustin as an example here, as part of the illustration. Let's say that my brother Dustin is in high school, and in the school that he goes to, 75% of the high school students play sports. Well, it's based upon just that information, it's very probable that my brother plays sports. Now, let's switch up the background information a little bit. Let's say that, for instance, 75% of the high school students don't play sports. Well, it's very probable that, given that information, that Dustin, my brother, does not play sports in high school. Now let's switch it up even more, make it a little bit more complex. Let's say that 75% of the students in my brother's high school play sports, but 100% of the students that are in the band do not play sports, and my brother is in the band. Well, it's very probable that my brother does not play sports given this new background information. So notice in those three illustrations, the probability is based upon the scope of the information available and the background information that is available. And as the background information changes, so does the probability. So when the atheist claims that God's existence is improbable, one of the questions we need to ask is improbable relative to what background information? Is the claim solely based upon the fact that there's evil in the world? Now, if that's the case, and that's the only basis for God's non-existence, then not that I agree with the skeptic, I can clearly see why the skeptic would draw such a conclusion. But here's the issue. The problem with that is that there's more evidence and more background information to be taken into consideration when looking at the existence of God. For instance, not only do we have to take into account the existence of evil, but what about the existence of good? How do I set the evil in the world and the good on the world? How do I quantify that as to make a probability claim? That seems to be arbitrary at worst and subjective experience at best. One person could have a horrible upbringing or live in a place of high crime and high immorality and say, yeah, based upon the evil that I've experienced in the world, it's probable that no God exists. But what about the person who grows up in Mayberry, right? Who lives the Andy Griffith upbringing, and things are relatively good and really good, and people are upstanding moral people. Well, they might say, well, given my subjective experience, the way that I see the world, or the way that the world is, given my upbringing, God does exist because it's been good. So how do we adjudicate between those two things? How do you quantify good and evil as to make a probability claim? It seems to me that is really, really hard to do. But secondly, there are also other arguments for the existence of God that need to be taken into consideration as well. Not just whether or not the problem of evil is a defeater for Christianity, but also we need to look at things like the Kalam cosmological argument, the argument from fine-tuning of the universe, the contingency argument, the argument from religious experience, the consistent laws of nature, the existence of reason, the laws of logic and mathematics, the information stored in the genetic code, the existence of mind and consciousness, the argument from free will, Old Testament prophecy, the life and resurrection of Jesus, and all of those things. Now, once considered, the atheist and the theist have to weigh these factors, against the existence of evil. And it seems to me that the evidence for God's existence has a wider scope than just the existence of evil, pain, and suffering, and even seems to offset whatever doubts might come about God's existence due to the evil that's in the world. Now, once again, taken in isolation, the problem of evil does seem to make God's existence seem, notice I said seem there, not that it is, seem improbable. But when you consider the totality of the evidence, the scales, I believe, at the very worst are evenly balanced, but I think objectively they tip in the favor of theism. And so the other thing that comes to my mind, the third thing that comes to my mind when we look at the problem of evil, pain, and suffering, or the problem of evil, however you want to identify it, when we're addressing this issue, who is to say that mankind is even in a good position to assess the probability that God has no morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil that occurs? God may allow certain evils to exist, which, admittedly, at the time, from a human vantage point, might seem pointless or unneeded, given our limited framework. But they are justified on God's framework. We can view our limited scope through, the annals of history, right? There are multiple times in even human history, as we look back, where humanity did certain things or enacted certain things thinking that it was going to be a good thing, but they didn't know the consequences of what some small treaty or some small decision played in the overarching scope of history. So there's also the idea from the illustration from science, and the chaos theory suggests that microsystems like weather systems or insect populations are sensitive to the tiniest agitations. A butterfly fluttering on a branch in West Africa may set in motion forces that would eventually become a hurricane. A small pebble can cause an avalanche. And so this is relative to the evidential problem because we have no idea of the evil, moral or natural, that might be involved for God arranging these circumstances, and free agents, in them to bring about his divine purpose. So while these might seem pointless or unneeded, we're simply just not in the position to judge or lay a confident probability that these circumstances negate the existence of God. So does the Christian worldview have an answer for the evidential problem of evil? I think so. I think the Christian worldview, in light of what we've already talked about, but also the doctrines that are laid out in Christianity, predicts the existence of God and evil. For instance, Jesus notes that on his account, Christians would suffer. That's John 18:20-21. There would be those who would leave because of the evil that's seen in the world. They would leave Christianity, and that 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 12 says that those who desire to live a godly life would experience evil against themselves. So it seems to me that these foundational Christian doctrines don't promise to minimize evil, right? But predict the coexistence and even increase of evil enacted upon Christians during their lifespan. And so from a theological standpoint, these predictions do nothing to negate the existence of God, but actually substantiate the claim that both God and evil do coexist. So I just want to encourage all of us that as we look at the problem of evil, whether it's the logical version or the evidential version, that there are good answers for these objections. And I hope that Jonathan Steingard at some point finds those answers. I hope that there's someone listening right now, or that will listen in the future, that will take this evidence and present it to Jonathan, because in his post he said that he's open for his heart to change again, and I certainly hope that it does. And so on this episode, we just looked at the evidential version, which is a probabilistic claim, and we noted that it's really hard to quantify evil and good. Also that we're not in the position epistemically, from a knowledge standpoint, to know the morally sufficient reasons as to why God would allow certain things. And then the Christian doctrines predict that evil and God would certainly coexist. So that's the show for now. Excuse me. In the next episode, we're going to look at the final piece of the problem of evil, and that's the emotional problem of evil. That's really is the one that is the crux of this issue. I don't know too many people who have said that they left Christianity because of the probabilistic or logical version. It's usually this emotional attachment to something drastic that has taken place, something traumatizing that's taken place in somebody's life that causes them to question and ultimately leave Christianity. So between this episode and next episode, go ahead and check us out on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, where we're pretty much everywhere. And also, if you haven't followed us, go ahead and follow us on those. Like and share our blog articles. Please, if you have the opportunity, like and share the podcast episodes with your friends, families, neighbors. And if you appreciate the content that we put out, we humbly ask that you would consider donating to The Daily Apologist. And you can do that at www.thedailyapologist.com/donate. Thank you once again for tuning in. Thank you so much for your support of the Daily Apologist podcast, the Daily Apologist organization as well. And remember, equip yourselves to engage culture.